Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian, and it's great to be joined this evening by such a power panel on George B. McClellan. And I want to first off thank the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War at Shepherd University for co-hosting and sponsoring the event. And that also means that one of our panelists is Dr. James Broomall, Director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. Thank you, Jim, for being here.
Of course, John.
Brian Baracz is on here, Park Ranger, Antietam National Battlefield. Dr. Tom Clemens, Antietam Field Guide and President of the Save Historic Antietam Foundation. Kevin Pawlak, Antietam Field Guide and Historic Site Manager, Prince William County Parks. And Dr. Ethan Rafuse, U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth. Thank you all for being here this evening on a Friday evening and being a part of this program on reassessing the life and legacy of General George McClellan. Jim, thank you also for helping to put together this panel. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this panel grew out of some of the online material that I've seen over the past couple months. I'm so happy to see so many people engaging with the humanities right now, thinking deeply about history in the Civil War era and how it resonates into the present day. But what I found, which is interesting, is one figure among all the generals who have enjoyed a renaissance or a reassessment that still seems to be deeply encrusted with a lot of mythology, a bit of confusion, is George B. McClellan. And there's manifold reasons why that is the case, which we'll talk about here today. But I thought it'd be useful to contextualize this conversation and turn it over to my new colleague and friend, hopefully, Ethan, and have Ethan, who wrote an excellent book on McClellan, McClellan's War, and has written a number of really important articles as well, have him give us sort of the bird's eye view of where the scholarship stands on McClellan and how historians, rather than popular audiences, but how historians have understood and assessed this figure. And so with that, then I'll turn it over to you, Ethan.
Thank you, Jim. Good evening. Welcome to everybody who is following this broadcast. I thank Jim for inviting me to participate, and to John for the work he's done putting it together. So great work, guys. Since I'm coming to you from 1,000 miles away out here in Fort Leavenworth, and scenic Fort Leavenworth, I figured I'd start with a big picture idea, and then a little comment on the battle, and then to tee up these gentlemen here so they can talk about those subjects a little bit more detail. Specifically, think about McClellan's place in history. Recently, a historian by the name of Gallagher, who I'm sure you've all heard of, has published works on looking at how the Civil War has been studied in popular culture, identifying various themes. The lost cause theme, the reconciliationist theme, the emancipationist theme, and then finally the theme that he believed had gotten underappreciated in both popular culture and literature, and that is the Union cause. The idea of the Union in and of itself being a worthy, virtuous cause. And no person exemplifies the separation of the Union cause from the emancipationist cause more than George Brinton McClellan does. If there's one person who kind of exemplifies the, sort of the starting point for Hunter McClellan historiography, Joe Harsha's essay in 1973, I believe, in Civil War history. We talked about McClellan go-round, and he talked about thinking of McClellan on a seesaw with Lincoln, and how that's an unequal contest. You're never going to get to the top of the seesaw if Lincoln's on the other side. That is George McClellan's experience during the war. Before the war, the man who's on the other side of the seesaw is Stephen A. Douglas, okay, who symbolizes the Union cause separated from the emancipationist cause. When Douglas dies in 1861, question is, who will be the single figure that people who want to support the Union cause but aren't so sure about the emancipation cause can rally behind? And they find McClellan to be that individual. And consequently, as mentioned, that puts him on the seesaw with Lincoln, which is going to make it very, very hard for him to come across well in history. So that's kind of a big picture idea. Now, in terms of the battle, one thing I often talk about, which I think is underappreciated, is in studying Antietam, McClellan's management of the battle. We are looking at sort of the opposite of Gettysburg, which I'm sure many of you have studied. In both cases, we have a commander trying to do operations on exterior lines against an enemy who's on the defensive with interior lines, and the same problems of coordination and implementing a tactical plan come up in both cases. So thinking about those parallels and what that says about the state of technology, military management at the time. These are things we talk about all the time at the Staff College, and thinking about what do you use to communicate? How do you sustain your forces? How do you manage your forces? How do you organize your forces? How do you keep fed? These are the parts of warfare that aren't as much fun as drawing arrows on a map, but these are critical to army operating both today and then. And with that, I will pass it off to my distinguished colleagues to refute with extreme prejudice everything I have just said.
Well, first, let me thank you, Ethan, because I think you made some really important distinctions here. And so I just want to further highlight that fact. And Dr. Gallagher has a very nuanced argument in the Union War. And I think what we from the 21st century sometimes have trouble understanding is that there are large numbers of Union soldiers in the AOP and in the Western armies that simply were not necessarily advocates for emancipation. And McClellan very much embodies that idea. He's a Democrat. He's an antagonist to Lincoln. He's an antagonist to abolitionists. And he is in some ways a supporter of the slaveholding aristocracy. And so as Ethan sort of highlights so well for us, his assessment both at the time, especially among radical Republicans and even the Republican administration, is negative. And then also later in history is likewise not necessarily buoyed any at all. But I think what would be useful as we turn it over to our distinguished colleagues who have had a lot of experience on the ground at Antietam in particular is how popular audiences have come to understand McClellan. And so Ethan gave us the bird's eye view, thinking about the scholarship. Now let's turn it over to you all. What's some of the mythology that you've encountered on the ground?
Well, before I get into that, I wanted to point out, and I learned this from reading Ethan's book, of course, that before the Whig Party imploded, McClellan and Lincoln were both Whigs. And when the party split over this issue of emancipation, McClellan became the Douglas Democrat, which was the conservative view of its time, where Lincoln embraced the more liberal branch of emancipation. And the Republicans. So, I think the political groundwork that Ethan laid is very important to understanding the relationship between those two men. That they were once in the same political party, and as it split, followed different branches of it.
Yeah, to read the recent scholarship, Mark Neely recently published a book on Lincoln and the Democrats when he talks about McClellan. And he's very dismissive of any discussion of McClellan's political views, which in some ways is dismissive of my study. But otherwise, it's a really fine book for discussing the problems the Democrats have as an opposition party during the war and trying to figure out how do you oppose Lincoln administration measures and policies without opening yourself to being accused of opposing the war. I think that sometimes Lincoln is so associated with the Union war effort that people miss that you can disagree with the Lincoln administration and still be loyal to the Union cause.
Which I would argue the overwhelming majority in the North still had a problem with emancipation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that the abolitionists were a tiny minority and considered to be radical for their time. Shall we talk about the campaign?
Kevin, we can, and I wanted to ask Kevin real quick too about these popular perceptions of McClellan that we often see and hear about because we've had so much of an inundation with it, with popular history and documentaries and memes and jokes online. What has been your perception of that as well, from the popular history standpoint, as being out there in the field and experiencing it firsthand?
Yeah, I think so much of McClellan's reputation has been really, we have McClellan, the historical figure that you see in the historical record, and then there is this McClellan that's been popularized and mythologized and certainly not romanticized, definitely the opposite of that. When folks will come to Antietam or other historic sites, somebody already commented on it. I saw that McClellan is a punching bag for people that are interested in the Civil War, and you see this in many different places. But in some cases, it almost gets to the point, and I'm sure these great primary source documents will come up in the term of McClellan's letters to his wife. But in the sense that I think they're so often quoted, but as Joe Harsha says, who's a great McClellan scholar, that they're not often read. And I think that people like to cherry pick a lot of what McClellan writes to his wife. They like to cherry pick a lot of what McClellan will say in military dispatches without fitting them into the greater context of what George McClellan is often talking about. And so obviously those letters, I think, did do a large disservice to him. But when you look at them in their entirety, I think that we do a disservice not just to McClellan, but to the whole history field to not consider them within their context, and to just, a lot of times we like to brush off anything that George McClellan says because we think he always overestimates, and whatever he says isn't worth merit, and that's doing a disservice to the study of history in order to just write things off like that because he's just George McClellan.
Well, and one of my pet peeves is that everybody sort of says, oh, well, he was a great organizer, but, and it's just sort of the hand wave of, well, there's really not hard to be a great organizer. And I think the concepts that Ethan just laid down point out that an awful lot of being a general is being an organizer. You can't fight an army till it gets to the battlefield, fed, equipped, supplied with ammunition and weapons. And that's no small feat. It's not.
It's in history. More soldiers have been killed by starvation than have been killed by bullets.
Yeah. And so the idea that he was a great organizer is not something to be dismissed. I would go on to argue that I think he fought the battle in the campaign pretty well, but the overlooked logistics, I think, are one of the problems that people have, is that most Civil War aficionados want to study campaigns and battles and who flanked who where, etc. But the nuts and bolts of putting an army together and getting it to the battlefield is a horrific challenge, and one that seldom gets talked about.
And if I could pause quickly, I think it's useful to note that, and Pete and John featured them, Judkin Brownlee and Tim Silver have a great book that just came out on environmental history. And they do a really interesting reassessment of the Peninsula Campaign and talk about how the environment dramatically impacted what McClellan could and could not do, and that's what speed he could do it. Moreover, Civil War Times, Dan Schoaf, give them a shout out, also recently ran an excellent piece about McClellan's supply crisis. And so I think these not extraneous items, but these external forces have dramatically impacted what he could and could not do on the ground, and audiences I think have been incredibly dismissive or just haven't thought about those features. So I really do want to highlight and pause on that fact. But with that, we have 4 experts here that know the Maryland campaign inside and out. So John, do you want to shift in that direction, or is there anything further you want to add?
Yes, I think it's that point about the Peninsula Campaign is huge, in that the environmental factors and such that impact that are often overlooked in popular history because it's not sexy enough to put on a documentary, where they're having all these issues with logistics and such because of rain and mud and everything else that's swamplands, etc. However, the overwhelming amount of people who have spoken about McClellan in online, in comments such as we've witnessed in the previous weeks with my work with Pete Carmichael, have been talking about the Maryland campaign time and time again. That's the biggie, because that's more in the popular history than the Peninsula Campaign. Antietam is out there all over the place, and we've already had several comments pertaining to Order 191 in the comment section, because this is the biggie. You know, this is the thing that is always talked about on the things ever since, you know, the Ken Burns series and on and on and on. And the question has actually come up about Order 191 several times, where people are asking the question, why, after he receives Order 191, doesn't he move fast enough? So we're going into this idea of McClellan being slow. So I think if we start the campaign, maybe we should start a little bit before that and then progress into 191 if anybody would like to start off. And Jim, if you have something that you'd like to add to that question, please do.
Brian, can you get us from the early days of September to Frederick, and then from there, I think Tom in particular wants to talk about 191, but can you kind of set us up a bit about the mess that McClellan really inherits after Second Manassas, and really what was the debacle, and then sort of, again, get us to the gates of Frederick and then beyond.
Yeah, certainly after Second Manassas, there's massive disorganization in the Union Army, and with everyone falling back into Washington, D.C., the Abraham Lincoln forced with that difficult decision. That's to put George McClellan back in command of all of the Union forces. It's not a popular decision with any of his cabinet members, and it's not a popular decision with many of the people living in the North at the time. But the ones that like that decision, the ones that it really matters to the most, are the soldiers that fought under General McClellan. And when they heard he had been reinstated, the morale of the Army, as many know, just skyrockets. And in less than a week's time, he's able to reorganize over 100,000 soldiers. He's able to strengthen the defenses around Washington, D.C. And in less than a week's time, he's able to begin moving those forces out of Washington, following Lee's army. And it doesn't sound very low. Just being at the park every day and the things that we hear from people, we always like to ask folks, you know, this reorganization and getting this army of tens of thousands of men on the road and moving in less than a week's time, that's a huge undertaking. And we always like to joke with the visitors at the park, you know, how long did it take for you to get your troops ready this morning at the hotel and get them out to the battlefield, right? So, I mean, it's a huge undertaking. And so as McClellan's moving into Washington, that's where, moving out of Washington up towards Frederick, I mean, the Army is divided. It just has to be because of the road systems and whatnot. When you think about the logistics, I mean, the logistics during the American Civil War, if you put thousands of men on the road, it takes up about a mile of space. And so if you line up the Army of the Potomac that's moving out of Washington, sort of one end to the other without using these various roads, I mean, the line stretches from almost Sharpsburg to Washington, D.C. So the Army does have to get divided into these wing systems that McClellan puts in command. And so as they're moving into Frederick, armies are separated. And at that point, things start to even turn more for the Union Army as far as Special Order 191. And we'll hear from Tom will talk a little bit about that and the finding and how important that was. And in the end, whether it's Ken Burns' Civil War series or years and years of historiography on it, you know, McClellan fumbled once he had 191. And when you really look at it, in my opinion, it's more that I don't know that those special orders helped him as much as they hurt him, because it adds to the belief in the end that Lee had a large army. So,
well, yeah, and let's put lost orders in context, because from August 18th to September 13th, there were 5 sets of lost orders between the Union and Confederate armies. When Lee was confronting Pope along the Rappahannock line, he had crafted a plan where Jackson was going to march west, led by Stuart's cavalry, and turn Pope's right flank and essentially trap Pope between the two forces and the Rappahannock River and destroy him. Unfortunately, those orders were captured at a little village in Virginia called Verdiersville, along with Jeb Stuart's plumed hat and caped coat, and very nearly Jeb Stuart himself. Those orders were in Pope's hands that night, and he responded and moved his army immediately, and the great battle to destroy Pope's army never happened, which is why you don't hear much about that lost order. It's not a battle, and so nobody talks about it. Now, of course, we know Jeb Stuart responded a few days later, riding behind Pope's lines, captured Pope's headquarters, captured his dispatch book with the numbers and disposition of all of Pope's troops, what reinforcements he was expecting. And Lee used that information to craft the campaign of Second Manassas. At the early stages of the campaign of Second Manassas, not once but twice, Pope's orders were intercepted, once by Jackson and once by A.P. Hill, which allowed Jackson's forces to be disposed to essentially sustain themselves against Pope's army for a day until the rest of the Confederate army got there. So we've got 4 exchanges of orders that are immediate. There is no question to their authenticity and are acted upon and avoid bad problems. Now, September 9th, Lee dictates Special Order 191 to split his army into 5 pieces, 3 of which are going to surround and eliminate the threat to his rear of the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry. And that, of course, would be Jackson's command and McLaws-Anderson's divisions combined and Walker's divisions. And then Longstreet is ordered to go to Boonesboro. And the armies move the next day out of Frederick on the 10th. Now, what those orders say and what really happened were quite different. Those orders are written on the 9th, distributed, and the army moves on the 10th. The lost order isn't found until about noon on the 13th of September, 4 days later. And what does it tell McClellan? Well, it tells him something about where Lee is, but much of it confirms what McClellan already knows. Before he finds it, he's well aware that Harper's Ferry is surrounded and cut off. So the order confirms that. But the order says Jackson's going to move by Sharpsburg and cross the river there at Shepherdstown. He doesn't. He goes to Williamsport, and McClellan knows that. He's told that. So the lost order is actually contradicted by the facts. He also knows on the 13th, when he finds the lost order, that Longstreet is in Hagerstown, and yet the lost order does not send Longstreet to Hagerstown. So how much faith are you putting in this if it's, in fact, wrong? It's 4 days old and contradicted by the facts, and there are things that aren't in the lost order, like the fact that Stuart's cavalry has a force in Westminster on McClellan's right flank and rear. That's not in the lost orders. So evaluating it, and the lost order uses ambiguous language. Jackson's command. What's that? And if you don't know, how would McClellan know? What's Longstreet's command? Because that's mentioned too. It must be bigger than a division because there are other divisions. And yet, after detaching Longstreet's command and Jackson's command and McLaws and Anderson's divisions and Walker's divisions, all of those troops are going to, and this is mentioned twice in the lost order, join the main body of the army. Would that imply to you that the main body is something larger than all these detachments? If it's the main body? Sure, we know today it's a very small part of the army, but what does McClellan know then? That's the key question. And he is presented with this order somewhere around noon or later. Stephen Sears is completely wrong that he has it in the morning. And he acts on it fairly quickly. Now, a lot of visitors, a lot of people who aren't students of this campaign have this idea that McClellan's army is sitting in Frederick on the 13th of September saying, gee, which way did he go? Did he go here? Did we go there? We're not moving. The army was moving. McClellan, habitually on the campaign, had been issuing orders in the evening for movement the next day. He had issued orders the night of the 12th. The army is in motion on the 13th. So the idea that he isn't responding or moving is false because he's already moving. He is following the orders, or the troops are following the orders that McClellan had laid out the night before. When he reads the orders, he sends his cavalry chief Pleasanton out to confirm them. And even before Pleasanton comes back, by 6 o'clock in the evening, he is issuing orders for an attack the next morning. I have less experience than my colleague Ethan, but I've been on a number of staff rides and asked professional officers, gee, you get a piece of intelligence and you map out a plan of attack. How long does it take you to do that? And when I tell them that McClellan did it in 6 hours or less, they're impressed. He has troops moving, in fact, west of Middletown within 3 miles of Turner's Gap on the night of the 13th of September, before anybody is responding to any order McClellan has written that has anything to do with finding 191. So I make the argument, and I'm presented this at several roundtables. I'll be doing it next week for a roundtable, that really 191 is almost meaningless. It's almost sort of a, it confirms some of what I already know. It contradicts some of the things that it says. By the facts contradict it, and it's 4 days old. And everybody's supposed to be back together by the 12th, and here it is the 13th, and I know they're not. So how important is it really? And I'll let my colleagues correct me where I've made mistakes.
Yeah, I would just, for folks to grab a few recent things to read on it. Excellent work has been done by our colleague, Steve Stottlemyre, book Too Useful to Sacrifice, his first chapter, published by Savas Beatty recently. And then Savas, yeah, there we go. Tom's got a copy of it. Savas has also published a digital essay called The Tale Untwisted by Gene Thorpe and Alex Racino. That's the most detailed look at exactly what time Special Orders 191 came into McClellan's hands. And so I definitely suggest both of those reads for those that are interested.
And the title is not an accident either. Stephen Sears wrote an article called The Twisted Tale of Special Orders 191. So their story is The Tale Untwisted.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that the context that you provide, Tom and Kevin, is absolutely vital, and it's often missing in these discussions. I think the time gap between finding and supposed action is what people tend to focus in on, instead of the length of time that had passed when they actually get it, and then all the factors that don't match up to the intelligence that he has in real time. So I deeply appreciate that. At this point, John, are there any sort of questions from our audience that we want to pose? We have a lot of material to cover here, but I want to give our viewers a chance to join the discussion.
There was someone, I have to go back here just a second and look. There was someone who posted about, because again, this mythology of McClellan being slow, which we wanted to talk about this evening. Andrew Lee Pike, can someone address the major shade thrown by Lincoln to Mac? If McClellan does not want to use the army, I'd like to borrow it for a time, provided I can see how it can be, or how it could be made to do something, quote. Does anybody want to handle that particular moment in McClellan history? I think that's an interesting one.
Well, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but keep in mind that Lincoln is first, last, and always a politician. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. Politics, in my mind, is an art. And McClellan is a master of that art, or Lincoln is a master of that art. And so he has the difficult task of keeping as much of the Northern public behind him in the war effort as possible. He could also, anytime he wants to, fire McClellan, and he doesn't. But he finds it politically useful to take cheap shots at McClellan to keep the public essentially on his side of saying, you know, the public is berating him. Why aren't we moving? Why aren't we doing something? Why aren't we winning the war? Let's go do something. Now, he could try to tell the public, hey, this is a whole lot more difficult than it looks on the surface, and it takes time, and we got to organize. Who wants to hear that? Right? And so he cheap shots McClellan.
Angie, I highlighted your quote too. That quote was said in January 1862. What happened was McClellan at the time is the commanding general of the army. And at this time, he's sick with typhoid fever. And so Lincoln who has pretty much delegated the war to McClellan at this point. In response to advice from Montgomery Meigs, decides to bring division commanders to the White House to discuss the possibility of conducting operations if McClellan were to die from his illness. So he says, if McClellan doesn't have intention of using this, I thought I'd borrow it, provided I could be made to see what it could do. And two of the participants in that conference are William V. Franklin and Irvin McDowell. And this is an important effect because one of the big themes and big problems in the Union Army Potomac throughout the war is going to be one of command relationships and trust between commanders. And what Lincoln has done here is and again, you can understand why Lincoln is doing this. McClellan could die from his typhoid fever. But by asking subordinate commanders to get there, and this is something Lincoln's going to do throughout the war until Grant comes along, is he is going to talk to subordinate commanders in the Army of the Potomac looking for a different perspective. Joe Hooker will give him one perspective. George Meade will give another perspective. And so this begins a process of eroding within the Army of the Potomac. It hits on fault lines that are already there in the Army among the division commanders, between the older division commanders who get their positions from seniority and the younger division commanders who get their positions because they're friends and they're trusted by McClellan. And you're going to have this conflict in the Army of the Potomac High Command that is going to infect its entire history, including the Maryland campaign, because one of those senior commanders is Edwin Sumner, who is going to be a problem for George McClellan in the Battle of Antietam, to bring it back to that.
Mm-hmm. Brian and Kevin, I have a question from the audience. I'd love for you two to discuss. I know there's primary source materials out there on this issue. Gregory David, you always hear this case about McClellan never stepped foot on the field during the battle. I know he crossed with Hooker, but where exactly did he go on the battlefield as the fighting raged? So this goes back to that idea of McClellan's separating himself from the action. So I'd like to hear from you two about your thoughts and what you found on that as well.
Brian, real quick, I know you've got a quote that you want to share specific to Antietam, but I think there is one of these myths about McClellan is that he was a moral coward, that he was never willing to commit his troops. Famously, one of his quotes, I have it written down here, to one of his addresses to the Army of the Potomac, McClellan says, "I am to watch over you as a parent over his children, and you know that your general loves you from the depths of his heart," something that's often shown to just show that McClellan loves his soldiers. He's never going to commit them to battle. But in the very next sentence, this is again putting everything into context, McClellan says, "It shall be my care, as it ever has been, to gain success with the least possible loss. But I know that if it is necessary, you will willingly follow me to our graves for a righteous cause." So McClellan is more than willing to commit his troops, and he himself is willing to enter into battle. On August 19th, 1847, during the Battle of Contreras, McClellan has one, perhaps two horses shot out from under him on the battlefield, and also a Mexican grape shot hits the hilt of his sword, and McClellan would be cited twice for bravery during the Mexican War. And then later on in the Civil War, during the Battle of Oak Grove that kicks off the 7 days outside of Richmond, McClellan was seen by several of his troops to take off his coat, climb atop a tree under fire from Confederate skirmishers to get a vantage point of the Confederate line. So there are just as many instances of McClellan being on the battlefield and being under fire as there are not.
Before we,
Brian,
real quick, I'm sorry. Just real quick.
Oh, go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to pause on this point here. And again, I'm a neophyte when it comes to a lot of this stuff. The cultural historian in the room who sort of dabbles in this. But I mean, there is this narrative that I think is very interesting in popular culture where we do sort of privilege those officers who are classified as more audacious, and in many instances create casualty counts that are absolutely catastrophic. Whereas we undermine and diminish a figure who I think is arguably quite effective on the battlefield, but has this incredible rapport with his troops and seems to trust them. And I was wondering if any of you had any sort of broad thoughts on that. And again, it's sort of, this broad cultural idea.
As latter-day armchair historians, nobody minds killing off people who've been dead for 150 years. It's all about, well, you got to be bold. It all looks great in hindsight, and you can do that. But at the real time, when you're measuring the cost of your victory in human lives, it does give you pause. Any commander who doesn't value the lives of his troops is not worthy of commanding them.
But there's also a political dynamic there, which is McClellan is trying to avoid stirring up anger in the north toward the south and anger in the south toward the north to try to bring about this union. He believes that if too many Union soldiers are killed, that it will, have a negative effect on the people back home, which will make it very hard for the North to refrain from taking the war to Southern civilians. So there's an element of his political strategy in his effort to conserve lives as well. In addition, at West Point, there was a lot of emphasis on engineer and fortifications. And if you look at the problems he deals with the peninsula, fortifications and engineering are very, very sound approaches to the problem he faces. Maryland's a little bit different. There's not much engineering or fortifications involved in that campaign. And McClellan's approach is different from the way it is in the peninsula.
The idea of McClellan being cautious and not wanting to use his army, we always at the park point out to people that he's cautious, doesn't want to use his army. He's in charge of the army on the worst, bloodiest day in American history, and in 12 hours he lost 12,000 men. So that's, I don't know, he was at one point willing to use his army.
Well, and to take that further, he attacks Lee's army 3 times in a week, and the casualty count is, as you say, the single bloodiest day in American history. And I like to throw that out to people who say, well, McClellan didn't like to fight. Really? I mean, you attack your enemy 3 times in a week, bloodiest day in American history, you don't like to fight?
A good question by Speedy Lee Elder about the place of the commanding general in a battle. And this kind of goes back to what I said earlier. I mean, if you're trying to coordinate a fight on exterior lines, you're going to be in a position where it's going to be very hard for you to influence one particular part of the battle. And going back to Gettysburg, I mean, Lee's not racing all over the battlefield to coordinate Ewell on one side and Longstreet on the other, because that's just simply not a good way to manage your army. And so to a certain extent, whereas when Lee's at Antietam, he can move on parts of the battlefield because without losing touch on all parts of the battle, which is, again, it's just an important distinction. Important distinction in the specific problem that McClellan is facing at Antietam versus the problem Lee has at Antietam.
Let's let Brian jump in with this quote here.
So on the evening of the 16th, in the heavy skirmishing the day before the battle of Antietam, this is from A.F. Hill from the 8th Pennsylvania Reserves. He said, a rebel battery to the right opened fire, and the battle was terrible. Amid the storm of iron and hail, George McClellan rode up to the battery in the cornfield just on our right and directed it to change its position in order that it might play upon a rebel battery on our flank. And a soldier in the 5th Pennsylvania pretty much said the same thing. He said they saw George McClellan and they started to cheer. General rose in his stirrup and waved his hand in such a manner as it was understood to keep quiet. Then it was received the contents from the rebel batteries. So on the evening of the 16th, he's out there trying to get these guys into position.
And the day before, he had been on the ridge observing the Confederate Army and sent all of the other officers and staff officers and commanders behind the ridge, staying up there with just Fitz John Porter calmly walking around during a furious cannonade. Whatever he was not a physical coward.
Okay, I've some of the chat discussion here, and specifically one by Bill on the question of a commander shouldn't have a political philosophy and there's a distinction between policy implementation and policy formulation. Having just taught a class on civil military relations, this is one of the big issues that comes up. The question between whether there's a line between the military and politics. War is inherently a political activity. The great military philosopher Karl von Clausewitz, that is his point. War is an extension of policy. Implementation of policy is execution of policy. It's all intertwined with each other. Just because one person's wearing a uniform, one person's not wearing. Now, I understand, this is a period of the Industrial Revolution, industrial specialization, the idea that occupational specialization, that the military is separate from lawyers or separate from doctors or separate from politicians. This is very central to the development of the military as an institution. This idea of professionalization and the idea that the military is something separate from politics. This flies in the face of what Clausewitz said about the reality of war, which is war is always a political act, and political decisions and military decisions are intertwined with each other all throughout. It makes a difference. In the Civil War, how should you attack a position or not in 1862? Well, if you're aggressive on the battlefield, like John Pope was, that's interpreted as being a good military man who's a Republican man. If you're cautious on the battlefield, you're interpreted as a Democratic military man and a Democratic politician. War, the idea of distinction between war and politics is something that people like to believe and is important and is valuable. But the reality of war is politics, politics is war. And so McClellan, there was nothing inappropriate about McClellan writing to Lincoln with his advice on policy matters, which is different from political partisanship. So,
and
issue to bring up here.
And just to that point, both of the probably most well-known instances when McClellan does offer his views on the war in August of 61, and then probably more famously July 7th, 1862, the Harrison's Landing letter, both times he does so, either at the urging or with the permission of Lincoln to do so.
Yeah.
So he's not just flying off on his own.
One other quick thought about McClellan exposing himself to the enemy fire. If something happened to McClellan, who was the senior general in the army that would take command? Sumner. I'd be careful.
And Jim, if I could just jump off your point real quick of our modern perception of these brash generals leading from the front are sort of the ones that we view as heroes. It's not quite comparing two similar people, but of course we all know what George McClellan referred to Lincoln in some of his private letters as a guerrilla. Another Union general that referred to Lincoln in his private letters the exact same way was John Reynolds, who was, of course, killed leading his troops on July 1st, 1863. Wow. And how do we view Reynolds versus how do we view McClellan?
Yeah, McClellan got the term from Edwin Stanton. So.
Yeah. Yeah. The first mention in the letters is guess who just came in and yeah.
Can I want to turn it back over to the audience, but before doing so, I want to direct something to Brian. So Brian, here's what I hear all the time. Agree or refute this, and the rest of you will have something to say too. The Battle of Antietam, tactical draw.
I would disagree with that. I would say it is a Union victory. Union victory.
So I'm going to push to Brian. So one, why is it that it has come down as a tactical draw? And two, let's try to chart the significance of what was a repulsion of the Army of Northern Virginia on Maryland soil back into Virginia. So let's draw this out a bit.
Sure. I mean, as far as the battle itself, I mean, you can say it's the same thing that happens in the summer of 1863. If you were to tell someone Confederate Army moves north, fights a battle, whether it's 1 day or 3 days, and at the end of those days, the Confederates are moving back into Virginia. Was that the Battle of Gettysburg or it's the Battle of Antietam? It's the same thing. And after Antietam, not only do you have Lee retreating back into Virginia and crossing Potomac, it's the first one to leave the field. He was leaving. You have the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. which you don't have at Gettysburg. And for those that would want to argue about, well, who gained the most land? Well, at Gettysburg, I don't know that the Union Army gained any land, if you're going to make that argument, where you could say at Gettysburg, the Ninth Corps does cross the Antietam Creek and has taken up position on the west side of the creek. So there's a lot of reasons why I think it's a victory. Lee is the first to leave the field. Politically, I would argue more important than Gettysburg. Why is it viewed that way? And I think you can almost go back and you can make the argument that it doesn't fit into the story of the lost cause. Lee could not have lost a battle.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's what people came to see. This has been among historians.
Mhm.
I distinguishing the various levels of war, strategic, operational, and tactical. I would say the Battle of Antietam was a tactical draw. Okay. Now, one of the things that makes it seem disappointing because the Union Army did have opportunities to achieve more than they did. But of course, what battle can't that be said? Tactically, I would say it was a draw. Lee is able to get away. Lee has lost the campaign operationally by the time they get to Antietam. The question in Antietam is just how bad of a loss it's going to be. And I argue McClellan had won the campaign up September the 13th, even before he got Special Orders 191. After that, it's just a question of how much of a victory is this going to be for the Union Army. So distinguishing those two levels of war, I would say it was a tactical draw, but operationally, the campaign was a Union victory. Sorry, Brian.
Sorry, Ethan. I side with Brian on this. I don't think it was by any stretch of the imagination an overwhelming tactical victory, but looking at Lee's strategy throughout the campaign, something that I've noticed is that every single phase of the campaign, Lee always has a physical, natural barrier between himself and where he expects the Union Army is going to come from. So firstly, it's the Potomac River. When he's at Frederick, it's the Manassas River. When he divides his army with Special Orders 191, he uses the Catoctin and South Mountain ranges. And then, of course, when he falls back to Sharpsburg, he has the Antietam Creek, which is, I think, it sounds dumb because the battle is named for it, but I think it's a very underrated tactical or terrain feature on the battlefield. Yeah. And if you look at it, the morning of September 17th, Lee still controls at least 2 of those 5 crossings. So he does have the opportunity to continue to use that barrier between himself and McClellan and the Army of the Potomac. By the end of September 17th, the 5 major crossings on the battlefield are all in McClellan's control. And so Lee no longer has that barrier.
Again, that's September 17th. If you want to go September the 16th, what does Lee want to accomplish tactically? He wants to reorganize his army, and then he wants to go north. And on the 16th of September, he is denied that operational option. At that point, 17th, it's a battle. And the question is, what can be achieved? I think McClellan's conducting the battle, thinking, let me see if I can destroy. First of all, they can't go north, so I'm going to cross Hooker. And then I'll see what damage I can do to Lee's army. But I don't want to do anything that's going to risk the campaign that I've already won. So even though he's got Lincoln saying to rebel army if possible, there is question. When the campaign begins, McClellan's, and he later says afterwards, if not for the emergency, we needed to get the army ready for the field again. It was not ready for the field. Nothing but dire emergency necessitated this. If I get him back across the Antietam, get him back across the Potomac, and then buy time to do the reorganization of the army. That's McClellan's objective. That's his measure of effectiveness and success in the campaign, and he achieves it. So I think looking at those levels of war, he takes away Lee's options, gives him a pretty good beating, and 12,000 guys lost at Harper's Ferry. Go talk to Henry Halleck about that.
With all due respect to the professional opinion, as far as the public was concerned in 1862, whoever held the field won the battle. Think about Manassas, Shiloh, etc. Whoever holds the field is considered the victory in Civil War in the general public's mind.
But again, that's important. But I've argued that you can look at, in some way, Lincoln is looking at it this way. I mean, after Fredericksburg, he gets the casualties, and he says, "You know what? This battle sucked. When we fight this battle every day for a week with these losses, the awful arithmetic adds up for us. You look at Lee after Fredericksburg and after Chancellorsville. Lee says, I was very, very depressed after both battles. You know, basically, we fought the Federal Army. You know, okay, we've got control of the Chancellorsville crossroads. But man, look at all it cost our army, and we could not exploit either of these victories. So now again, attrition is not a popular, is not going to be a popular strategy, but it is a strategy. So you know, looking at it that way,
Mm-hmm. I can tell that we are winning over some in the comments, and I can tell that we have struck a nerve with some in the comments, which is exactly what we wanted to do, because we want people to think. We want to talk about this and debate this for a while to come, and that's the great thing about history. So I love this question from William Brown. If McClellan was so great, then why was he fired, and why was he not reassigned to command later in the war? This gets down to something that I think is traditionally held that we need to discuss, because this is something that's I think an important point, and has been put across very bluntly by William. Thank you for that question. So who would like to tackle that first? Anybody?
I would love to. People are big fans of Brian, so let Brian go.
All right, Brian. Go ahead. You get first.
People what they want.
Don't forget to unmute yourself.
I'll go back to what Tom said earlier, that politics plays a big role in the whole decision right there. And early on, you know, Lincoln knew that McClellan was the best that he had. He gave it a try. I mean, it wasn't for lack of trying. I think at that point there was just too much baggage after Antietam, and trying to put the best face forward. And the army needs to be moving, where a quarter of the Union Army is brand new. There needs to be some time to get those guys whipped into shape. There are many units fighting on the Antietam battlefield for the first time. They're walking into the battle, and they're learning tactics as they're walking into the battle, how to march and how to deploy into a battle line. And as many troops as you had in the Union Army that were green, just as many were as beat up and shoeless as you had in the Confederate Army. We have numerous accounts of uniforms, you know, pants up to guys' legs. They don't have shoes. In the 27th Indiana, the 12th Corps fighting in the cornfield. So I think it was just time for a change, and politics played a key role as well. I had my hat on.
Yeah,
politics. Go ahead, Tom.
Go, Kevin.
I think politics is a large role. I mean, it's no coincidence that the last northern midterm elections will end November the 4th of 1862, and the order removing McClellan is drafted the next day. I think that has a big piece of it. But something else is often lost in the jabs that Lincoln throws at McClellan and McClellan throws back at Lincoln is that for the first year of McClellan's command of the Army of the Potomac, his view of the war and Lincoln's public view of the war are not very different at all. It's not until Lincoln will announce to his cabinet on July 22nd, 1862, this war-sweeping measure of announcing to the country the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, that's when McClellan's view of the war and Lincoln's view of the war start to diverge and eventually become so far apart that I don't think there's any reconciling the two.
Yeah, back to the politics. Lincoln, and particularly the more radical members of the Republican Party, are quite well aware that the only reason that they are in power is because the South left the Union. And so essentially a minority party is suddenly now in control of the government. And they want to try to figure out a way to keep that control. And let's not forget the American tradition of successful generals becoming presidents. George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Zach Taylor, etc. And so for many of the radicals in Lincoln's party, the last thing they want is a popular Democrat to command the army that very well might win the war. Politics.
If you look at the situation McClellan's relieved, very understudied is the campaign that carries the army from the Potomac down to Warrenton. The Army of the Potomac is moving better than it really ever had in its history. It is a remarkable series of marches that it makes, which is one of the reasons the Army is so stunned at the decision to have him relieved from command. But as Tom says, the basic situation is, it's to the point that Lincoln and McClellan just simply, theoretically, they could have worked together, but the situation just becomes so polarized, president versus general, and in that case, the general's got to go, and so that's where it was.
And interestingly enough, there were whole brigades in the Gettysburg campaign in 1863 who fought the Battle of Gettysburg, believing that McClellan had been restored to command. That rumor ran through the army on the march to Gettysburg. They knew that Hooker had been replaced. A lot of the soldiers assumed it was McClellan and were essentially glad and theoretically, at least, welcomed the idea that McClellan coming back. So it wasn't that the soldiers had lost confidence in him. It was, in fact, Lincoln and the cabinet and the party.
And the higher echelons of Union command did, for a brief moment in 1864, discuss bringing McClellan back to command Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. But that was getting right up to the point, of course, of the election. There had been rumbles that McClellan was potentially going to be a candidate for the Democratic Party, and the Lincoln administration was not willing to risk the fact that if McClellan, maybe this Democratic candidate, is going to see success in the Shenandoah Valley, then how is that going to look for the Lincoln administration in the polls?
Yeah, the Blair family had reached out to some of McClellan's people, saying, if you will drop this politics thing, we'll find a command for you. And McClellan just said, I'm not going to play that kind of game with a military appointment. If you're going to return me to command, return me to command. Don't do it for this political purpose. Which is one of McClellan's endearing and awful features, is just how he hates politics. This is a guy. He just despises politics and politicians of all stripes. But as mentioned earlier, as a general, the reality is what you're doing is an inherently political activity. He knows that, but he resists that. And this is where a lot of the bile that's in his unpleasant correspondence comes out. His perception that, and again, this is one of the dangers that the country is running into, and that you do have an army that's got a strong affection for the general. And the danger is that will translate into, a general. You want to bond an army with its commander. The theme that those guys in Washington are stabbing you in the back is a very, very powerful theme. And there is that danger. McClellan has the army with him, which could be a very, very bad thing if he really were to act on his grievances towards. Now, there's some of his staff officers who talk about that kind of stuff, but staff officers often say a lot of stupid things.
Just to piggyback on what Ethan said, in October of 1862, McClellan was heard saying that civilians make policy and the military carries it out. It's action at the polls that is the remedy for political errors.
Yeah.
It's very.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I was reading the papers of Colonel Walter Phelps Jr. this week for another project, and he took command of a brigade literally just before the Battle of South Mountain, on the slopes of South Mountain, commanded that same brigade at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and then 3 of the 4 regiments in his brigade. Their time of service was up in the spring of '63 and went home. But he had been commended by everybody up and down as a very good brigade commander. But he writes home to his wife and says, I don't think the prospects of my getting a general's star are very good. I am a Democrat and a McClellan man.
And that's where Grant's very smart, because when all the talk begins to pop up about Grant possibly being a candidate for office, he makes sure that Abraham Lincoln hears that he will not be interested in running for politics. And that really clears his way to the 3-star and commanding general position in 1864.
Yep.
We have one more question here from the audience. I know we're running a little bit later than an hour, but I do want to get this one in because it is good for all of you to answer. independently, especially with Brian and Kevin and Tom with this. But it's Gregory David's comment. What is the general public opinion of him by first timers to Antietam? So now's your chance to talk about the good, the bad, or the ugly, whatever it would be, depending on who you've interacted with. So Kevin, Brian, either one of you guys want to start? We'll go down the ranks here.
I'll go real quick. I think McClellan is still very much in the public light, just for the simple reason that any single time you get a dispute between the military and the commander-in-chief, that, of course, always pops up in politics, always op-ed and pieces are written about comparing the current relationship of a general and commander-in-chief to McClellan and Lincoln. And so I think people always are certainly aware of McClellan, and most first-timers, when they come to Antietam, have the typical perception of McClellan as slow, arrogant, and just frankly not a good general.
Brian, what are your thoughts on people who visit the battlefield and their opinions of McClellan?
Just exactly what Kevin said. I would say probably 85% come in with a not so good opinion of George McClellan. It's sort of the same thing. He's slow. He didn't want to be in the army. Was arguing with Lincoln all the time. So it's always an uphill battle. Almost a daily basis, we'll have a discussion. Get to have good discussions with people about various aspects of George McClellan, and it's using arguments like we've all used this evening to try and maybe not change their mind, but at least open their mind to see that there's a lot more behind George McClellan than what they saw in Ken Burns' Civil War series.
Yeah. I like to tell people that's where I started out too, but I've done a lot of learning since then.
All right, I would just on Tom's comment, Tom Leopold's comment in the chat. About George McClellan, he was not the best general in the United States. I would, on that, my 5 top generals in American history are 1, George Washington, for reasons don't need to explain. Number 2, Winfield Scott.
Yep, that's my number 1.
Number 3, Matthew Ridgway. Number 4, William Tecumseh Sherman. And number 5, Creighton Abrams. Not just because of the battlefield accomplishments were, but because of their importance to the Army as an institution.
Nice.
And if I could jump off that comment too real quick, I would just I would say that we're not trying to make George McClellan sound as if he is the best general that the United States Army has ever seen. But I think it does justice to the history field and to Civil War history as a whole to at least be willing to have your mind open to look at everybody in their context, and judging McClellan not by what we know Lee had, but by what he knew and by the decisions he made because of that.
And on that note, I think I want to just explain again the architecture behind this. And I think some audiences probably know this, but by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Grant was very much maligned. And that reputation continued for decades, all the way through the early 80s with a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography that was very damning of him. He did enjoy a renaissance in the 90s, and then now, of course, in the 2000s, he's been entirely reassessed. And what I was hoping this panel would do, and it did incredibly well, is to shed light on original source materials that would offer you all, our audience, our learned audience, the ability to think differently about McClellan in the same way. And Ethan himself, of course, has written extensively on this, as has Tom. And so I'd invite you and Steve and others, Solomire, to go to those works, to go to the secondary sources, and to go back to the primary sources. Both Brian and Kevin have highlighted for us incredibly well. Mm-hmm. If we look at the sources in context, not in edited collections, but in context, not in snippets in books, but in context, and go back to the original source materials, we see a very different figure here. And I think that's been one of the most enlightening things for me, since I've been part of the area for the past 5 or 6 years, and I've worked with field guides, I've worked with Brian, and now I'm working with Ethan here, is just to understand a lot more about McClellan rather than just kind of a quick punchline at a party. or a quick punchline for Ken Burns. And so I'm going to let you all have the final word here, but I just found this evening incredibly enlightening and just informative. So thank you. And I like that we actually got some tension too. That's a good place. When you're a teacher, the best thing you can ever have in a classroom is a conversational tension. And that's actually a really hard place to get to, where you get people to civilly disagree with one another and to sort of move things along. So thank you all. I just learned an immense amount of information this evening, so thank you. And before I turn it over to the rest of you, just again, I want to thank our audience. I deeply appreciate your time, and I hope all of you are just healthy and safe and well. So with that, I'll turn it over for any final words, and then let John sort of close us out. So Phyllis, any final words?
Well, I'll always get in a plug for Save Historic Antietam Foundation. If you haven't been to the battlefield in the last 5 years, you need to come back. We have really, working with the American Battlefield Trust and the Park Service, accomplished some really great things. We've picked up 60 acres inside the boundary of the battlefield. We have demolished 3 non-historic houses and barns and outbuildings, and restored some really important properties, including the triangular field south of the cornfield, to their wartime appearance. And so if you haven't seen Antietam in 5 years, you need to come back and see how it looked at the time of the battle, because we've gotten it a lot closer than it was before.
Yeah. I'll jump in real quick. Jim, I know you wanted to touch on McClellan in the election of 1864, and we didn't quite get a chance to do that. But I think one of the greatest myths of McClellan is the thought that if McClellan wins the election of 1864, that the South will achieve its independence. And McClellan, without getting too much into this, here's what George McClellan had to say about that after the election. Says, of course, I can't tell you what the Secesh expected to be the result of my election, but if they expected to gain their independence from me, they would have been woefully mistaken. And one historian writing about the election of 1864 says this: George McClellan never wavered in his determination to put down the rebellion. Historians have no cause to deny the sincerity of his efforts. And if anybody, you'll probably all be shocked at who wrote that, but it is a compliment of George McClellan from Stephen Sears.
There you go.
So, the election of 1864, McClellan's election, I don't think would have resulted in the separation of the Confederate States from the United States.
Ethan, final thoughts on this evening?
Yeah, I've just the past few weeks I've done 2 3-hour seminars on the Maryland campaign with officers who are going to be attending the School of Advanced Military Studies, and in those 3-hour seminars, I think only one of them did we get McClellan to Frederick. Okay, so there's a lot to say about the Maryland campaign. That makes me appreciate how time can fly. Since America, according to Eleanor Roosevelt via Ricky Bobby, is all about speed, nasty speed, let me talk some speed. On October the 23rd, Ulysses S. Grant shows up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Okay. And eventually has under his command William Tecumseh Sherman, George Thomas, and Joseph Hooker. Whatever else you think of Hooker, you definitely, as a subordinate commander, you got to rank him highly, and of course, Sherman and Thomas. And he's going to fight Braxton Bragg. Okay. But he doesn't do so until November the 23rd, when he starts the fight on Orchard Knob. So that's Grant. It takes him a month between getting command, with Sherman, Thomas, and Hooker as subordinates to defeat Braxton Bragg. Okay, so it takes a month. George McClellan takes command, and he takes command on September the 3rd. And under his command is the all-star team of Edwin Sumner, William B. Franklin, and Ambrose Burnside, none of whom are going to be confused for the Cooperstown Burnsides, right? By September 20th, he has defeated not Braxton Bragg, but Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, and Jeb Stuart. And now, what makes Ulysses S. Grant so freaking slow, right? That's the question we got to ask here. Now, of course, I'm sure people have explanations for those. Explanations for Grant. And, well, they've listened to us give excuses for George McClellan. And the question, of course, is for historians, what's the difference between an explanation and an excuse?
Brian, you have to follow that for your final thoughts here.
I'll give my time back to you, John. Yeah, I'm not sure I can follow that.
Well, as I like to say about the Maryland campaign, by the time it was over, McClellan's army had captured 39 flags, 13 cannons, 12,000 small arms, and 6,000 prisoners. McClellan had lost 1 flag and 1 cannon. That smells like a victory to me.
And I would like to say, as far as historical memory is concerned, because I like to touch on that a lot, Tom, before we went live, you said a very interesting thing to us about Lincoln and Lee, and I think that really showcases historical memory and George McClellan. If you'd like to share that with everyone.
Oh, sure. To the general public who haven't done an awful lot of reading about the Civil War, and I say this as a retired history teacher, but it gets dumbed down. And the more we go on, the more it gets dumbed down, because every time we add another decade, then we have to take away from what we've been teaching about the previous decades. So essentially, most people come away from the Civil War looking at 2 major icons that come out of the Civil War. One of them is Abraham Lincoln, and the other one is Robert E. Lee. And when McClellan essentially argues with Lincoln and defeats Lee, that makes the icons less iconic. And so we have to somehow diminish McClellan so that the icons remain icons.
I never thought of it that way until we got together in this room earlier, and it really opened up my eyes with that. I'm going to use that in the future if you don't mind. I'll quote you.
By all means.
When I was to finish out, when I was a historical interpreter full time, I always used to say with my impressions, it was always be controversial but be correct. In other words, try to go against the narrative, but footnote your history when you're doing it. And I think this evening's presentation is just another instance of that, when we go and we hear about what we've heard of McClellan in popular history and previous works throughout the centennial and on and on and on. I think that we have together, your expertise has helped to open some eyes as far as let's be a little more curious about this man and as a general, and possibly as just a man in general. And I think that's what a lot of people get out of this. I'm seeing a lot of great comments concerning that, and people even giving book recommendations in the comments, which is awesome, which I love to see. So I personally want to thank each and every one of you for spending your Friday evening with us. This has been fantastic, and I'm really glad that we got to go over so much, and yet so much more we could have gone over. But I'm really happy that we all could be together and talk about this subject and have more people talking in the future about George McClellan and his generalship, because the comments are still rolling in. So that's fantastic. And I do want to thank Jim and Georgetown Moore Center for co-hosting and co-sponsoring this event and getting this tremendous panel together. So thank you once again, Jim, for doing that.
Yeah, no, and thank you all. I mean, again, Ethan, Tom, Kevin, and Brian, I so deeply appreciate your expertise. Folks, there are decades and decades and decades of knowledge accumulated here, and years and years and years of serious archival research. So thank you for sharing that with our public audiences this evening. I so deeply appreciate it. I just value this stuff so much. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. I was very flattered to be invited. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all very much. And thank you all for all the comments, questions, opinions, just like we have of history. It's great to have a discussion going with this. So thank you, everyone who's been watching on Facebook and on YouTube. It's been a great evening. Take care of yourselves. Be safe. Bye, everyone.
Will do. Take care.